Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me on the Bio Breakthroughs podcast. I'm your host, Jared Taylor. Joining me today is Nolan Townsend, the CEO at LEXEO Therapeutics. Nolan, how are you today?
I'm great, and great to be here on a beautiful Friday morning.
Absolutely. I'm excited for us to chat. We'll kick things off. If you could give us a little bit about your background and then kind of lead that into an overview of LEXEO Therapeutics.
Great. Well, so I'm originally from the West Coast, from Los Angeles. I went to college on the East Coast, and did my first work in the biopharmaceutical industry at Pfizer, where I worked across a variety of roles, um, both in and outside of the U.S. The last few of which were area president roles in Pfizer's rare disease business, where I was involved, among other things, in some of the gene therapy work that Pfizer was embarking upon at the time. I was also involved in some of the work in precision cardiovascular treatments, and was involved with launching a treatment called tafamidis for transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy. So I had my first involvement in the precision cardiovascular space through that role. And I think you'll see themes of some of that experience in the work that that LEXEO is doing today. So the origins of LEXEO are as a spinout from the genetic medicine lab at Weill Cornell in New York. This is Ron Crystal's lab. Ron was one of the early pioneers in the gene therapy field. He was involved with dosing the first patients with gene therapy utilizing a virus in the early 90s, and he's been involved in several other milestones in the field since then. And Ron had accumulated this very interesting pipeline of gene therapy programs in his academic lab. I say interesting for a few reasons. One, just the pure number of programs, and that he had almost 18 programs sitting across five different therapeutic areas. But also the target of the programs was interesting in that he had begun to apply gene therapy beyond some of the ultra rare and rare monogenic diseases that the gene therapy field is has been historically focused on, and to a large extent is focused on today. He'd begun to apply gene therapy to non-rare non-rare conditions. So in this one academic pipeline, I could sort of see the full evolution of the gene therapy field into from the rare monogenic diseases that gene therapy is focused on today, ultimately to larger diseases that could have this broader societal impact. So we formed the concept of LEXEO around this academic pipeline. We had some decisions to make about the disease areas to focus on. We decided to focus on in one side of our pipeline, genetic cardiovascular diseases. I can give some context about why we decided to focus there, and then we also decided to focus on central nervous system diseases, of which a large portion of our pipeline was treating a gene variant associated with Alzheimer's disease, the ApoE4 gene. And the question I commonly get is, what is the link between genetic cardiovascular diseases and Alzheimer's disease? There is a link. It's probably not obvious. So as we look at taking first the cardiovascular field, there's a very large, obviously, unmet need in the cardiovascular treatment area. There's a lot of existing commercial therapies in the cardiovascular space. But there's very few precision medicines in the cardiovascular space. I'd say less than 10% of the total, revenue in the cardiovascular space is coming from precision therapies. And I would compare this to oncology, where today probably 50 to 60% of treatments in oncology are, precision therapies. And there are reasons why each of these disease areas has evolved in that particular way. But I think we're seeing a turning point in the cardiovascular treatment landscape, where we think precision therapies will play a more significant role, and this will begin to look a lot more like oncology. That breaking these cardiovascular diseases into their genetic components, and then applying precision therapies to treat them, will be the future of the cardiovascular treatment landscape. And so, in part, LEXEO's company profile, thesis, and mission is focused on being a leading company in the precision cardiovascular space, and delivering gene therapies to treat some of those genetic cardiomyopathies that are today, some of them are untreated or insufficiently treated. Interestingly, there's a similar paradigm which we envision in the Alzheimer's disease space, that the treatments that have been recently approved, and lecanemab and aducanumab, are all one size fits all treatments. That every patient, regardless of genotype, is can access those treatments. The labels are relatively broad. However, if you look into the data from those studies, actually each of the genotypes within ApoE, the apolipoprotein E, which is the gene that confers risk or protection in Alzheimer's disease, responds differently to therapy. For example, ApoE4s respond differently to therapy than ApoE3s. So we believe precision medicine will play an important role in the Alzheimer's disease space as well. And we're advancing several precision therapies to treat patients in that disease area. So the entire thesis of LEXEO is set up around the unmet need that we believe precision therapies can deliver a treatment option for. And we believe the unmet need is the highest in the cardiovascular space and here in Alzheimer's disease as well.
And Nolan, talk me through where your product candidates are at today.
Yeah. So we have two ongoing phase 1/2 studies. One on the cardiovascular side for the cardiac pathology of a disease called Friedreich's ataxia. We are right in the middle of that study. We're expecting the first clinical data readouts in the first half of 2024 from this program. This is the first gene therapy for Friedreich's ataxia to enter the clinic. And we're excited to advance a therapy into a disease like this one with very high unmet need from a life expectancy point of view. 70% of the FA patients, the cause of death is cardiomyopathy. So we believe that this potential therapy could have a substantial impact on these patients' lives. Our second program in the clinic today, also in a phase 1/2 study, is treating ApoE4 homozygous Alzheimer's disease. And here we're delivering the ApoE2 gene to the CNS of ApoE4 homozygotes. And I can talk more about this if it's of interest. But this is an ongoing phase 1/2 study for which we would expect to complete enrollment this year. We've actually read out low-dose biomarker data associated with this program, showing a reduction in some of the biomarkers that are commonly associated with Alzheimer's disease. And this was at the CTAD conference last year. So some very good early clinical data. We'll have the full data set reading out in 2024. And I think for both programs, they address a very significant unmet need within those patient populations. Our next program to enter the clinic will be treating arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. So it's another cardiac program. And this program we would expect to have in the clinic by the end of this year.
And Nolan, can you talk me through a little bit about how LEXEO, what you're developing is different from the current treatments, specifically in the neurological and cardiac spaces today?
Yeah, so I'll start on the Alzheimer's side of things because there's obviously been a lot of developments in the treatment landscape for Alzheimer's disease over the last even couple of months or the last year. It's sort of a dramatic change in that there was no true therapy that was approved to treat the disease. Now we have two with accelerated approvals, and then one I think will hopefully receive a full approval shortly. So both of those treatments, those are amyloid antibodies that are focused on lowering the amount of amyloid plaque burden in the brain, are focused on a single pathogenic mechanism of the disease. So they're amyloid treatments. However, what this may miss is that Alzheimer's is a very complex disease, and there are potentially other pathologies involved like tau tangles, blood-brain barrier disorder, inflammation, and so on. So those treatments may not sufficiently treat the totality of this very complex disease. So what we're doing with our gene therapy is going upstream, treating the genetics of Alzheimer's disease, which we expect to have a downstream impact on multiple different pathogenic mechanisms simultaneously. And so this is the only gene therapy for Alzheimer's disease that's in the clinic today. And it's a unique approach, obviously, focused on the genetics of the disease. Now, what we're interested to see in our phase 1/2 study is whether the addition of the ApoE2 gene, so therefore focus on this genetics, does have a downstream impact on the different pathogenic mechanisms that are commonly associated with Alzheimer's disease. And importantly, we're thinking about amyloid beta, tau, phospho-tau, and does the addition of the ApoE2 gene have an impact on those? And actually, our low dose data did show that a reduction in amyloid beta, tau, and phospho-tau versus baseline, which shows, I guess, very early proof of biology that treating the genetics is having this downstream impact. And I think, this is common as we look across genetic diseases, that the early treatments are focused downstream on a single pathogenic mechanism, but ultimately, in a lot of cases, the genetics are what is the driver of the disease pathology. So on the cardiovascular side, I think it's also very interesting. There's been challenges historically in delivering what I'd call nucleic acids or genetic payloads to the heart. A lot of this has been a challenge of delivery. I think what we found is that, at least as the technology as it exists today, adeno-associated virus, or the AAV vectors that we use, are probably the most efficient delivery system to get nucleic acids into the heart. And within that, I think we're using a highly, cardiovascular tropic vector, where we can very efficiently deliver these, call them genetic, payloads to the heart. So that's what's unique here. I think what's limited genetic medicines in the cardiovascular space has been a challenge of delivery. I think we're finding increasingly more efficient, cardiovascular delivery systems, and this will allow us to increase in, ever greater number of cardiovascular diseases with, gene therapy. But it's not limited there. I would see other genetic medicines, gene editing, RNA therapeutics potentially as well, that can begin to treat, cardiovascular diseases. We have a number of programs now focused on loss of function mutations, but obviously this technology can be applied to gain of function mutations as well. So I think we're really at the tip of the iceberg with respect to the cardiovascular treatment landscape and what genetic medicines can achieve there.
Staying on genetic medicine, gene therapy, I want to go into something that you talked about at Bio, right? You were talking about accelerated approval. Can you provide some perspective on the pathways needed specifically for accelerated approval in gene therapy?
Yeah. So just some history on accelerated approvals. This is really meant to deliver therapies to patients and diseases of very high unmet need. This started with the HIV/AIDS crisis and the patient advocacy there to get treatments to patients faster. And it has since been a pathway broadly utilized in the oncology space, and has been utilized in the rare disease space. But until very recently, it has not been utilized as broadly within the genetic medicine or gene therapy space. So we saw the first accelerated approval of a gene therapy with one of the Bluebird therapies in the last couple of months. But interestingly, yesterday, we had a significant milestone in the accelerated approval landscape, which was the accelerated approval of Sarepta's Duchenne's muscular dystrophy gene therapy. So, classically, accelerated approvals, instead of being based on clinical outcomes data, they're based on surrogate endpoints or intermediate clinical data. So I think the misunderstanding sometimes is that this is potentially less robust data, or that the approval is not as robustly reviewed by the FDA. I mean, these are FDA approvals. They're just using surrogate endpoints that are reasonably likely to predict the clinical outcomes. And the other aspect of an accelerated approval that's important to note is they require a confirmatory study that does demonstrate the clinical outcomes that are associated with the disease. So there is a ultimate clinical outcome study that is associated with an accelerated approval. So and in most cases that outcome study needs to be ongoing at the time of the accelerated approval itself, and this is the case, for example, with Sarepta. So I think the discussion around accelerated approvals has evolved quite significantly. And one of the major challenges has been this unlinking of the accelerated approval itself from the ultimate reimbursement of the therapy. And this is what we saw in the Alzheimer's field, is that both products received an accelerated approval, but there was a reimbursement decision by Medicare that in effect limited access of those therapies to patients. And this is really one of the first times that this has occurred. And it's a little bit of a troubling concept, because what it means is that the accelerated approval pathway, which is meant to deliver therapies, in diseases of high unmet need, which typically means life-threatening diseases or diseases like Alzheimer's disease, where if you progress, there probably is not a way to reverse that progression. Um, and our regulatory framework is set up to effectively deliver treatments faster to those patients. But if we now insert a reimbursement barrier for those therapies, this will both deter investment of companies into accelerated approvals in the first place, but secondarily, we're effectively not allowing patients access to the therapies that they, that they need, and can oftentimes save their lives. So that's one trend that I think is developing in a potentially somewhat troubling way. I think the other, I think this is for the industry to think about, is that there have been instances where companies have not completed the confirmatory studies. Now, there are reasons for that, in that once a therapy is approved, sometimes it is challenging to have a confirmatory clinical trial when there's a commercially available treatment. So there are reasons for that. But I think as an industry, we need to pull together, run the confirmatory studies. Ideally, the confirmatory study has started before the therapy has received an accelerated approval. So from a feasibility standpoint, you can complete the study if it started before that time. And I think that will help to just, from the FDA perspective, allow continued access to to this pathway for both patients and the companies that would like to deliver therapies for these diseases of high unmet need.
And Nolan, before we wrap up here, I want to be able. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And
Sure.
the accelerated approval piece, especially, is I don't think it's something we talk enough about in the space. So you being able to provide that additional context, it really helps, and give us also like some background and history on it. What's next for LEXEO that really excites you every single day?
Well, I'm excited about the therapies we're advancing. In particular, I think our Friedreich's ataxia product candidate is very exciting. It will give us an opportunity to potentially deliver a treatment that could save lives for patients with the cardiovascular manifestations of Friedreich's ataxia. And there's thousands of patients that are developing these symptoms, and we would hope to very quickly get a therapy out there for them. And frankly, this is the type of therapy that would squarely benefit, or where patients could squarely benefit from an accelerated pathway and getting the therapy there sooner. So it's an example, actually, a very, very, very clear example of where if somehow this pathway were not available, patients would be waiting longer for a treatment. So I'm excited about the progress we're making in this program in particular, and I think what we can do in the coming months and years to get a therapy out there in the near term. So that's what's exciting coming up for us.
Well, Nolan, I wish you and the company all the best of luck, and hopefully we can have you come back on in the near future and give us an update on where things are at, and then we can also, pick your brain on some other thoughts on the space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.